the experience I had in fourth grade, or the teacher I had in fourth grade, I could tell she just did not like my presence in her class. And I still don't really know what I was doing, or how I was coming off to make to get such a visceral reaction from her. I do know that I was very bored in her class, but I wasn't the type of student that engaged in misbehavior when I was bored. But I did daydream and not stay on task, and she probably could tell that I wasn't really paying attention to her. I was oftentimes in my own head, in my own thoughts, and when I was supposed to be paying attention to her, I would be doing things like, playing with my pencils, taking, writing, taking my. I remember taking my pencil erasers and writing faces on them, and so that was a peculiarity I used to do. I used to create stories out of numbers, and I talked about that in the first chapter of my book. So every number had a personality and a character, a characteristic, and a gender, and they had relationships with each other. So I used to do that. I looked at the ceilings a lot. I used to like to study ceilings for some reason. So the contours, the dots, maintenance issues, molding. So all of those things would kind of go into this story in my head. And so I just had this very difficult time paying attention the way that she wanted me to pay attention, because of the way that my brain was working during that time. So my mother switched me from that school to, and this was considered a semi-private school. So then my mother sent me to the public school, my neighborhood public school, because she wasn't going to continue to pay for bad grades. So I went to the public school. It was a completely different experience, different types of students there. Students who, most of the students I was going to school with were middle class. Then I ended up in a school with mostly poor children, and it was a different type of atmosphere. I didn't have friends there, and so I just basically stayed to myself, tried to stay out of trouble, socialize as necessary. But my teacher in that class, she thought that I remember her telling my mother, and I remember this vividly. I remember her saying, I can't see, because my mother was telling her about all the problems I was having at my previous school. And I remember her telling me, or telling my mother, I can't see how this young man had problems at any school, because he's one of the most gifted students I've ever taught. And I remember being very confused by that, because I had already accepted that I didn't learn as well as other students. And now I'm having a teacher tell my mother that, in these glowing terms, not any kind of tentative or way in which manner in which she used any kind of, qualifications. Under no uncertain terms, she said that I was one of the most gifted students that she ever taught, and that that I should be going to the magnet schools or somewhere that could stimulate me. So I had these two experiences back to back, and I think I came away from that with a balanced perspective of who I was. I didn't fully buy into me being any more gifted than the average student. I kind of believe that the teacher liked my personality and my presence and my demeanor. She kind of liked the middle class personality that I had, in contrast to what she was dealing with. And the teacher before that, I did feel like the fifth grade teacher counterbalanced that. So I also came away from it believing that I wasn't as slow as the other teacher thought I was. Now, when I think about the students that we have today, in reflection to my own experience, I think about how a teacher's perception of them can really mold who they are. Teachers are the professionals that have worked with a lot of different students. And when a teacher clearly either believes in the student or does not believe in the student, it does shape who that student ultimately becomes. Now, moving on from that experience, I would say that most of the teachers that I've had since then, um, I've had neutral experiences with them. Some positive, some not so positive, but none to where I felt like they really changed how I felt about myself. With some positive examples, but when I think about the things that ultimately helped me to achieve in life, it has a lot to do with the experiences that were provided to me from the various educational institutions that I was a part of. And I think that, when I think about, joining the newspaper staff or joining ROTC or JROTC and some of those things that really made a difference, right now I see the schools not focusing as much attention on the things that help me to be who I am, and more attention to things that um, is really an afterthought in a lot of our education experiences, like standardized tests and things like that. So there are a lot of things that we need to think about, and as we try to shape the best educational experiences for our students. Just to wrap up, how I became Dr. Toldson, from the one who went into slow learning program. I graduated from a public school. My GPA coming out of high school was around a 2.8. That 2.8 actually made me the second highest ranked male at the school. So that gives you a sense of how people were doing at that school. Why did I have such a low GPA? I think at that school, I didn't really think that a high GPA was something that was important to aspire to. Um, I was considered a school leader in the sense that I was a part of organizations and things like that. I also didn't make the best score on the ACT. Again, I took the ACT knowing that I needed a good grade, but I didn't have a whole lot of prep or anything like that. So my score on the ACT was around a 19. Now, luckily back then, you can get into LSU with that. I wouldn't have been able to get into LSU at this point. When I got to LSU, I was sensitive to the fact that my public school education and my ACT scores put me at a lower position than most students there. And I wonder, and the only reason I went to LSU is because I was a part of a summer bridge program. I wondered if I should stay at LSU because I didn't think that my background had prepared me for that institution. And I ended up working at junior division. That was a junior college at LSU, or not necessarily a junior college, but where you go in before you got placed in your major, or the college that's associated with your major. And so through that job, I ended up having to stuff the academic records of every first year student. And so this was before everything was computerized and it had the digital information. So I'm taking paper records of high school transcripts and high school and ACT scores that they took in high school. And I'm also putting in their college transcripts from their first year. And I was doing my own research while I was conducting this job. And so I was, on my own as an 18-year-old, looking at ACT scores and high school GPAs and comparing them to how well they did their first year in college. And I saw enough examples of people with low ACT scores that still did well, and of high ACT scores that didn't do well. And that was another experience that made me think, maybe I could do this LSU thing. Maybe LSU isn't out of my league. And so I graduated from LSU in 4 years. From there, I went to Penn State and got a master's. After that, I went to Temple University and got a PhD in counseling psychology. I began my career at Southern University and HBCU in Baton Rouge. That's where I spent 3 years as an assistant professor. And then I came to Howard University in 2005 as an assistant professor. And from that point to now, I became a full professor, also worked with President Obama's administration, became the editor of a few journals, and published quite a bit, and wrote the book last year that we'll be discussing today. So that's a long explanation of how I became Dr. Toldson.
All right, we're about to dig into some questions, but before I do that, I do want to allow our fearless leader, Dr. Marshall, to speak if he has anything that he would like to say.
I want to thank everybody for being here and being a part of this. This is important work. I hope that we have questions so Greg doesn't have to lead all of the questions. And I do want to get into the book. And I challenge you all, Dr. Toldson, you know this, we've talked about this. We have a racial equity policy in Jefferson County Public Schools that is arguably the best racial equity policy for public schools in the nation. And we have leaders on here that are hell-bent on making sure that that policy has more teeth and more work. And a lot of the people on here have read the book around of your book and are really interested in just what they can do as leaders and what they can do building on your book to help make sure that racial equity is something that JCPS lifts up. So appreciate the fact that y'all are sitting amongst what I consider probably one of the best scholars around this work in the nation. And I'll just hand it back over to him, but let's get into some questions and really digging into the book.
So again, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat and let us know, and we'll allow you to ask that question. But we'll start out, Dr. Toldson. You talk about that we can't close the achievement gap. We need to deconstruct the achievement gap. So please get into what you mean by that and provide some insight on that.
Okay. So I consider the achievement gap a social construct, not anything that's real and material. And typically when I ask people what is the achievement gap, I get varied responses, and it doesn't matter whether I'm talking to a group of teachers or a group of principals or a group of administrators. Even if I talk to a group of researchers, if you ask what the achievement gap is, you always get a different answer to that. So the question becomes, how are we even legitimately working towards closing something if we don't even really know what it is, if we can't even define it? And maybe the solution is to come up with a working universal definition of the achievement gap. But as long as it's been around, the mere fact that we haven't done it yet shows that it's probably something that's impractical to do. And so what we really need to do is understand what the utility of the achievement gap is, and if perhaps it's outlived its usefulness. Now, when we ask, like when I ask what the achievement gap is, a lot of times I get all these widely varied responses, and a lot of times the responses are kind of choppy and uncomfortable and don't flow very well. But when I ask what achievement is, and when I ask what achievement is outside of the context of the achievement gap, so if you forget about what you know or think you know about the achievement gap and just respond to what is achievement, then you get more lucid responses. People understand achievement better than they understand the achievement gap. But the problem is that their understanding and conceptualization of achievement is doesn't even really apply that well to their role and their responsibilities to students in school, because we've gotten so far away from that. So achievement to a lot of people means, working towards your goals, doing your best, um, uh, being resilient, understanding how to solve problems, understanding how to work with others, understanding how to carve out what's right for you, or to define what's right for you and take steps towards making that happen. These are some attributes that we may observe in our students, and there are ways that we could and should cultivate that. But when we're thinking about, numerically, how do we get a certain score to be closer to the scores of another group that as a group they're lagging behind, then our roles become a lot more muddled. So I always try to explain the things that I recommend, and the line of thinking in terms of what I would consider a post-reform era of education. So we've been stuck in the same era of education for about 30 years. Post-reform era came out of the reform era of education, the era that we're in right now, came out of the post-desegregation era. Most of you all who grew up in the 40s, or who are 40s, in your 40s now, especially your late 40s like me, we grew up in the desegregation era, right at the beginning of the post-desegregation era. So a lot of us, when we went to school, busing was probably one of the most hot button agenda topics. And the idea was that if we could just integrate the schools, then and get beyond segregation, so we can achieve fully integrated schools, then that would make all the problems right. Around the late 80s, early 90s, we realized that even if you integrated the schools, that things wouldn't get the way that they needed to get. And we also realized that people weren't ready to comply with universal mandates towards integration. You had white people uprooting their entire families and moving to districts because they didn't want their children to go to school with Black children. There were entire private schools and all of these that were established because of that. So from the 90s till today, we've been in this era where we haven't thought that much about integration anymore, but we've been trying to standardize education across different demographic groups. So we want predominantly Black schools to show the same measured success as those that have more white children. The achievement gap is front and center of the reform era movement. So is standardization. So testing becomes very important for a reform era. What I've been arguing in some of my latest work is that right now we need a post-reform era. And that post-reform era, I think by necessity, it won't have the achievement gap as a central way that we measure whether or not the school is doing well. So that's, y'all can go on talking about that, but that's why I'm very agnostic towards the achievement gap, and believe that the achievement gap needs to be reconstructed so that we can get to a post-reform era and make education more accommodating to a diverse cross-section of students.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Miss Whitney Fry. And Abdul, if you don't mind, you can make it where people can unmute themselves if they would like. I'm going to ask the question that she asked. You talked about the films Lean on Me and Dangerous Minds and how those images impact individuals' perceptions. Can you talk a little bit more in depth about how schools and communities can address these negative perceptions? Specifically, can you talk about how schools can work to build more positive cultures for our Black students?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So there are a lot of stereotypes that we use to understand Black students, and there's a certain perception that we have of predominantly Black schools, and I always contrast my perception uh, between what I see on TV and what I see through popular films like Lean on Me and Dangerous Minds. When I look at films like that, um, you know, I'll think to myself, why would anybody want to work in a school that looks like that? Um, but when I go to a graduation of some of those same schools, some schools that have all of those same um, numeric indicators, in terms of graduation rates, and they have all these struggles. But I've been a graduation speaker at some of those schools, and I've gotten a chance to participate or attend some of those graduations. And what I see at all of those schools is a diversity of students that are trying to figure it out. All of them have a valedictorian and a salutatorian that gives a great speech. All of them are going to college, or have some students who are going to college somewhere. All of them are very proud, and their parents are jumping for joy because their child is graduating. And so there's a lot of elements of those schools that get ignored because we're only focusing on some of these problem areas. And in those students who are doing better than you expect, those students who are beating the odds, I think that we miss an opportunity to really engage them in the solutions. I graduated from a high school that had a lot of problems. So my sophomore year, there was 2 shootings and a stabbing that resulted in one of my classmates dying. That happened in 1 year at my school. Um, my mother pulled me out of that school for 1 semester during my sophomore year, because I actually saw the person get stabbed and killed. So no parent would want their child to be in a situation like that, in a school like that. Um, I knew the person that got killed. He was and he was known to be a drug dealer. He wasn't anybody that I associated with, but I do remember he used to treat me friendly for some reason. So he would float around the school, and he would look out for me, so to speak. Not to the point where he was getting in, so close that I thought he wanted something. But sometimes you just have an affinity for someone, and he seemed to have some affinity for me for some reason. But that was my memory of him, and he ended up getting stabbed to death at the school. So my mother used my father's address in the suburbs, who I wasn't living with, and they had gotten a divorce when I was 6. But she asked him, could I use his his address so that I can go to school in the suburbs. And so I went to that school, which was a lot more racially diverse. But I ended up having a lot more problem with my classmates there. Um, there was, everything from some racist classmates, which I hadn't ever dealt with before because my other school was just about all Black. And they had some suburban thugs that found out that I came from one of the toughest schools in the city, and who knew they had gangs there too. And so there was word that got out that this gang wanted to fight me at the suburban school. So I told my mom, if I'm gonna deal with this shit, I might as well go go to the school where my friends from my neighborhood go. So I ended up going back, and we had a principal that was able to clean up the school, so to speak. And so I went back my junior and my senior year, no violent incidents at the school, and the principal, he was able to, and I have some criticisms of him too, but his presence was very powerful at the school. You know, he was around. The other principal, he just, you know, he never came out of his office. He had clearly lost control. This principal had control over the school, and he didn't carry a bat, but he was in the halls. He was talking to people. He was a motivational speaker type. So he had the charismatic type leadership that you need. And he gave us some things that instilled some pride. We got student IDs. He brought the newspaper staff back, which I was a part of. He brought the yearbook book back. You know, we didn't have any of these things when the school was going down. So those things were very important. Now, these are some of the opportunities that he missed. There was an activist teacher that also brought physics to the school. I took physics, and that's the only reason I was able to go to LSU. The principal, the same principal that helped to reduce all of the violence, he took physics away only 2 years after this activist teacher brought it in. And as a principal was taking away physics and higher level math and things like that, he was bringing in welding, auto mechanics, and, you know, things like that. So he clearly had this image of what Black students needed. But in his image, if we just followed that model, you all wouldn't be talking to me as Dr. Toldson right now. You know, I might be fixing your car, but I wouldn't have been given the chance to have a career in academia. Another thing, and this is, you know, some specific guidance that I want you all to take back. As a student who had potential at that school, and so I was the type of student who was reading a lot of stuff outside of the school. You know, I was reading the ISIS papers and the autobiography of Malcolm X and, you know, all these types of things. I was challenging my teachers on what they were teaching us. I was writing for the newspaper staff, but I wasn't getting high grades. But I was getting higher grades than everybody else, you know, than at least the males. You know, we had, you know, this top 10 of women, you know, girls in my school that was doing the work. And then you had a couple of males that was doing good enough. And then you had the majority of the males that just didn't care at all. Nobody ever talked to me about the fact that I could clearly make better grades than what I was receiving. So why I didn't have the motivation to get better grades. Nobody ever talked to me about, you know, why my grades was higher than the average male at the school and what I might be doing that they could learn from. The focus was mostly on the ones that just wasn't doing well. So I think, you know, as we think about the schools that's featured in films like Lean on Me and Dangerous Minds, one of the things that we do is we focus all of our attention on this minority of very disruptive and dangerous children, and we don't focus any efforts on the ones who are like myself, navigating that environment quite successfully. You know, being able to talk to the worst of the students and stay out of trouble, and even serve as a motivation to some of my classmates who was interested in learning some things that they weren't even teaching me in school, and who was making better than average grades for that school and had ambitions to go on. I could have clearly been a part of their solution at a Lean on Me school or a Dangerous Mind school or the school that I went to. But voices like mine were rarely ever heard or used.
Okay, we got about 20 minutes left. I want to get in as many questions as possible. So if you could limit the next few to 2-minute answers if you can.
Okay.
I want to read a quote from the book. Educational administrators should enforce the policy that every teacher, regardless of race or gender, is prepared to teach any student. White female teachers, especially as the profession's majority, should gain tools of cultural competence to serve any student regardless of their racial background or gender. So a lot of administrators on this call, can you please let us know how we can help white teachers do this for Black students?
Yeah, so I think you should think of, if you are a white teacher and you are teaching at a school that has a very diverse population, you should think about everything you need to learn in order to effectively teach that population. I think that and also understand that that population is very different from your own and from you. Um, and it's also a population that has characteristics that should be celebrated. Is not full of characteristics that's standing in the way of their success. So think of it as if you had the opportunity to teach in Paris, and you know very little about French culture, and so and you want to be in the position to teach French children without being offensive, then there are certain things that you would learn about that culture because you want to put forth a good faith effort to demonstrate to them that you care about who they are and you're not one of those arrogant Americans that's going to come in acting like you know more than they do. It's the same thing if you're teaching at a school that's predominantly Black or predominantly Hispanic, or that's racially diverse, and you know that you need to learn a variety of different cultures. You know, in the case of, you know, if you're going to Paris, you probably would talk to people from Paris, you know, from the community that you're teaching in, to learn, you know, what do they celebrate? What do they find offensive? What are some of the things about the culture that I should understand? And so these are types of things that you should do to understand that.
One of the things, this is John, one of the things that I would like to do for the remainder of the time, I want staff to ask you specific questions about the book and let you unpack it briefly. We don't have a lot of time, but ask the question, and then Dr. Toldson, if you can answer it as parsimonious but thorough as possible, so we can kind of begin kind of on the downslide of this book chat. So I want some staff that has had some chewing questions to ask Dr. Toldson while you have the author of the book on here to ask those questions. Probably have time for about 3 to 5 questions, and he'll be as quick as possible, but as thorough as well. So let's go, JCPS.
And Greg, we actually had a question from Madeline Marables in the chat about the book.
Ms. Marables, if you want to, you can start us out.
Yes, so I appreciate you getting on here, Dr. Toldson. My question was about teachers, and I know that you said in the book that it's important that they have a relationship with their students, and I'm sure you've personally can attest to some situations you've noticed where it's made a tremendous difference. So I wanted to see your opinion and thoughts on that, and if you had any examples or anything that can leave a lasting impact on our district.
Mm-hmm. So just generally having a relationship with your students?
Yes, yes, sir.
Well, I mean, I think that the most important thing is to understand that every student has a story and has something to contribute to our society, potentially, and the best thing that a teacher could do is bring that out of them. But teachers have to check their own biases when they attempt to do that. Sometimes when I do professional developments with teachers, I'll ask the question, you know, how many of you all on the first day of school, you have this sense of who's going to do well in your class? And a lot of them will raise their hand. And then I'll ask, how many of you all on the first day of school, you have a sense of who's not going to do so well in your class, or who's going to present a problem? And most of them will raise their hand. And then when I would ask the question, well, what are some of the things that you pick up on that will make you either believe or not believe they're going to do well in school? And I'll hear all types of things. I'll hear everything from, you know, how well they pay attention to who their parents are. And so, but what they didn't realize is that they were showcasing their biases. On the first day, there's no way you can know who's going to do well and who's not going to do well. unless you're using biases. And what you need to understand is that through confirmation bias, those students that give you that good first impression, and a lot of things that they pick up on, they may not even be willing to admit or even be conscious of, because sometimes a student, just because they're pressed real well and they're wearing really nice clothes, and or they have on nice shoes or something like that, sometimes that'll give us a signal. So when you're using those biases, you're going to create the things that you anticipate. Another analogy, and I'll end with this. There's a cognitive exercise that some magicians or people who deal with cognitive sciences that they do. And so if you can scatter dots about the screen and then have somebody concentrate just on one dot. Like if you stare at one of those dots, you will literally see the other dots around it disappear. Literally. There's an analogy that to the classrooms. Like if you are lasered in focus on a certain child, whether it be for positive reasons or negative reasons, there are a lot of children around them that are disappearing to you. I was an invisible child for in a lot of experiences until I became like a junior senior, where I became where my leadership started to kick in. But there are a lot of students who are invisible to teachers because we aren't taking the time to spread our attention around and to really focus in on all the different students and trying to actively trying to find, what about this student, even if it's that they speak up or that you saw them, try something or deal with frustration well, but how do you reveal the things about them that they're good at, as opposed to just exposing their weaknesses?
All right. Anybody else from JCPS have any questions?
Yes, we got a question from Michael Lowe in the chat.
Okay, if he's not going to mute himself, I'll read it. He basically is asking how well of a predictor is family structure in for moving forward and advancing academically for Black children. Does two-parent households, one-parent household, how does that factor in the predicting students' ability to move forward or advance academically?
Yeah, Dr. Toles, this is Michael Lowe. That was that chapter that you had about the single-parent household, and I was reading it and just really wanted to get I was kind of confused by the message, but I was trying to get exactly what you were saying were the factors behind single parent versus two-parent households in the Black community with education. Okay.
Well, in a nutshell, whether or not a child is in a single parent versus a two-parent household, it doesn't factor a lot into how well they do in school. As it stands right now, more Black students are in single-parent households than in two-parent households. So if you go to the schools around and look at the valedictorians, look at the ones that are doing well, most of them are from single-parent households, as are the ones that aren't doing so well. There are some clear things about a parent that can help us to, that we can leverage, and that has a lot to do with whether or not the child does well in school. So if you ask a parent, whether it's two of them or one of them, do you expect your child to go to college after they finish high school? That their response to that question has a whole lot higher correlation with how well their child is doing well in school when compared to whether they are together. So the short of it is, there's really nothing that a school can do effectively with household composition. It's just not. There's no strategies associated with it, unless you want to start a matchmaking service. There's really nothing you can do with it, but there's so many things about parents that we can do it. Parental expectations, discipline styles, so authoritarian authoritative parents, not authoritarian, are permissive, but authoritative parents, parents who instill academic socialization, parents who engage well with the school, the amount of time that the parents spend at the school, all of those things matter. And there are some clear things that a school can do to promote those types of things among parents. So when schools are talking about single parent households, there's never an instance where schools are talking about single parent households where they are trying to do anything effectively in building a strategy that serves that problem. It's usually just a way for them to talk about problems generally that they feel like they have no control over. So if we want to get parents involved, get parents involved. And if we want our strategies to align with the research, there are strategies that align with the research. But again, whether or not a child comes from a single parent household or a two-parent household should have no effect on how we view them. And I say that as someone who grew up in a single parent household.
Dr. Toldson, Dr. Thomas Avery, principal at one of our high schools, had a question. Thomas Avery, can you ask your question, please? Avery, you there?
There we go. Thank you. So, yeah, as I was reading your book, I really I was a math background guy, so this is really kind of speaking to me when you're talking numbers and understanding and interpreting data and statistics. It also made me reflect on like my training as a young educator, as a teacher, and as an administrator with Ruby Payne's Understanding Poverty. And then it's all, you know, we're totally reframing the way we understand how to support students now. So I was just wondering, like, what do you see as the big difference between like reframing our understanding of approaching race and culture in schools versus the way it was approached 2 decades ago with understanding, you know, Ruby Payne's framework for understanding poverty?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you know, beyond trying to understand poverty or a situation that you're a part of, I think we need to understand who we are and how we go about trying to connect with people who are different than us. I think that, so I believe we pathologize poverty too much. I think it needs to be normalized. And just like we don't pathologize poverty, we tend to associate a certain measure of superiority to wealth. And so you can have students that come from very wealthy families, and we assume that they have certain desirable characteristics because they're wealthy, but it's really just that they have a lot of money. Aside from that, they could have all these other problems. So I think that, you know, instead of putting people in poverty in a classification system and trying to analyze them as this other, I think we should spend more time talking with them and really trying to understand their experiences. There are poor parents who want the best for their children, but they really don't know what the best looks like. They don't have the agency or social capital to navigate the system. So it's really that more that holistic feeling that I want my child to do better than me, but they need a lot more support from us to understand what how navigating that path looks. But I think the main thing we need to do is just to open up better dialogue and to reduce the biases that we have with poverty, and understand that biases can come from a good place or a bad place. Even if you feel like you want to help people in poverty, if you are holding some of the stereotypes and if you're not building relationships with them, then you still end up doing some of the same damage as those that have negative feelings about them.
All right, Ms. Angelique Shearer, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question. We got time for about 2 questions. 2 more questions.
She says she can't unmute.
Okay. Well, I'll read it. Thank you for the chapter on Black students with disabilities. As a special educator, I know that we have students who are twice exceptional. Please share some strategies that school administrators can use to identify their students who are twice exceptional, especially Black students.
Hmm. So I'm trying to think of a way to answer it very quickly, and these specific strategies. I can't really think of any right now. Um, I know that in the book I talked about general types of ways in which we should think about students that don't put them into certain categories. Um, but yeah, we probably should just go ahead to another question, and maybe we can talk offline and try to, so I could understand the question better and give a better answer than what, rather than just ramble for the next few minutes.
Okay. Anybody else from JCPS? You have time for another question? And I don't want to waste the last couple of minutes waiting on somebody. So if you think of one, you can ask it after this, but I'm going to ask one. You mentioned in the book, once students feel secure, learning becomes easier and more meaningful. What can administrators do to particularly make sure that Black students are feeling safe in the learning environment?
Yeah, I think Black students need to be invited to share and talk and contribute more and have more agency over their education. There's been a couple of panel discussions I've had in school districts, and I call it the panel discussions "Mile in My Shoes," where I would moderate a conversation with Black males in the school district. And what would be pretty interesting to me is that a lot of the teachers in the school district and a lot of the people who work with these Black males every single day, they would be so surprised at how well the students could talk about the things that they needed and wanted out of education. And understand that these are students that you have access to every single day. So at any point, you can ask them questions about how they're feeling about what's going on and what they like and what they dislike. But we don't do that enough. So we really need to open up the dialogue. I remember, my son getting in trouble in kindergarten and not getting the kind of rating that he wanted to get. And so I tried to talk to him about how he could do better and what he might have done wrong that day. And then when I tried to see his understanding of the conversation that we had, asking him, so what are you gonna do the next day? And he said, be quiet. So, and that's completely, that's not what I wanted him to say. And so I had to, try to unpack that. But that is a signal that we are giving children as early as kindergarten, that the key to survival in school is to be quiet. And by the time you get to high school, you've just become accustomed to, in order to survive school, I have to be quiet. But that just leaves you in the situation where you're not connected to education. You don't feel safe. You don't feel secure in your environment. You don't feel like your voice is being respected. And so it leaves us with a lot of the problems that we have right now. So I would say, try to release them from the burden of feeling like being quiet is the pathway to success. We need to hear their voice, and we need to open up the type of dialogue where they're going to contribute to their own success.
We have time for one more question. Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question before we conclude? All right, well, I'll ask one more before we wrap. You say before you attempt to recruit or retain Black male teachers, you have to ask yourself some questions. One of them is, what is the role of the Black male teacher? What, in your opinion, should the answer to that be?
Yeah, and I did answer that question in that chapter, but just to reiterate my own words, The role of the Black male teacher is to contribute to interprofessional dialogue and to help non-Black male teachers to understand Black students better so that everybody is capable of teaching Black students. The role is not to discipline or to have them as a surrogate father or to replace something that you think that the children grew up missing. It's somewhat of a role model. It can be, but even that role, if you're recruiting Black male teachers so that Black males could have role models, if that's the primary reason, you are still missing the boat and missing opportunities. The primary reason is because you want your profession to be more diverse, and a more diverse profession helps everybody in that profession. So if in the recruiting Black male teachers, you think that your white female teachers can maintain the status quo and things will get better, then you're missing out. And you're really just going to set up your Black male teachers to be in a vulnerable situation, and you're not going to resolve the problems at the school. So the role of Black male teachers is to other teachers, first and foremost, not to Black male students.
Real quick, Dr. Toldson, and thank you. I'm going to get off here in a minute, as we all are. If you could give us 2 or 3 more minutes and give us some BS stats that we need to just stop thinking and believing and fortifying in our schools. I know they're in your book, but and you wrote an article on it even before the book. If some BS stats that are just out there that are exacerbating racism in Jefferson County Public Schools in P through 12.
Yeah, I think the main one that hurts the schools is the notion that Black students from single parent households are ill-equipped to do well in school. I think that's the primary one. And then beyond that, you have things like there are more Black men in prison and college. There's also this notion that every generation is more violent than the previous generation. Whereas many of the people on this call, those who are closer to my age, we were the most violent generation of Black people that existed. So my 40s club, it was us. The students now statistically are far less violent than we were when we were their age. So we should be celebrating that. But because of the BS, we have this notion that they are more violent than we are. The acting white theory, that's another one. Also the graduation rate. A lot of times people don't understand the numbers that go into calculating the graduation rate, and then NAEP scores and reading scores. A lot of times that's taken out of context, and it makes people confuse proficiency in reading as measured by a test with illiteracy. And so that's the BS that makes people believe that Black students are illiterate. So those are some of the BS stats.
Thank you so much, Brother Toldson. I will hand it back over to Greg, or a closing comment from any teacher, and then we'll hand it over to you to Dr. or Greg to close out. A closing comment from any educator on here, then we'll hand it over to Mr. Van. And let's try not to take long with a comment, please.
They say they can't unmute.
Well, is there anybody that would like to unmute, and I will unmute you?
I was going to say, it's Jeff Marshall from Crosby. I just really appreciated your read. As a white man, I found myself at times getting angry about things that were said, and then I would have to check, why am I getting angry about that? And I'm like, oh, it's because I believe this, because I thought it was just truth. And so trying to wrestle with your race is not something that I grew up doing. So it was a joyful pain to get through, if that makes sense. So I really appreciated the time that we had to read it, because there was a lot of things in there that made me recognize, I appreciated struggling with. And also it also confirms some things that I've learned over 23 years of how to really help students, especially students of color. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. That's the first time I heard someone put it in those terms. But that's very helpful to me as an author. And I thank you for being so honest and candid about those feelings.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Marshall. One of the quotes in the book, a student told Dr. Toldson, "We have been hearing negative things about ourselves for our entire lives. This is the first time we're hearing that not all the news about us is bad." So just like you're wrestling with some of this stuff, it's BS, and the things that I learned from the book, I told my wife, everything I've been taught about Black students is a lie. That's what I felt after reading the book. So I really appreciate you, Dr. Toldson, for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you for taking the time to write the book. One last thing, our superintendent, when he addressed the district, I guess it was this week, he talked about how the third grade is the peak of interest for students. And when you talked about your son saying in kindergarten, the best thing for him to do is to stay quiet. I think if we're teaching our students to be quiet and not allowing them space to be themselves, to be heard, to be seen, that by the time they internalize that they just need to be quiet, that's why their interest starts to go down in school. So I think that was very profound what your son said. And thank you again, Mr. Marshall, because that was great to be that transparent. So do you have any closing remarks for us, Dr. Toldson?
No, I thank all of you all. I enjoyed this, and I like the style of being able to talk about myself personally, not just professionally. And I guess one other thing I want to say in closing, I am anticipating a grant. I've been recommended a grant from the National Science Foundation to work with 2 school districts over the next 4 years, Broward County in Florida and Jefferson County. So just waiting on that award letter. So you all may be seeing some more of me.
That's great. So thank you so much. This has been recorded and it will be available for podcast via YouTube link. So we'll send that out. And anybody that you think needs to hear this conversation, we encourage you to send it out to them. If you have anything that you learned today or you appreciate it, please tweet it out. # no more BS, or tweet it out to at JCPSDEP1 and let us know how you felt about it. And if you'd like to do something like this again. So thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you again, Dr. Toldson, for giving us your time.
Thank you.